Respected presenters, dear participants, ladies and gentlemen. The subject of my presentation is Global Debt Trends in 2024, Surging Borrowing and Shifting Debt Ratios. Global debt comprises both public and private debt. It rose from $235 trillion in 2022 to $250 trillion in 2023. However, as a share of global GDP, it declined slightly from 238% in 2022 to 237.2% in 2023. Since the 1950s, global debt to GDP ratios have followed an upward trend, peaking at 257.5% during the 2020 pandemic. Over the past 3 years, the ratio has fallen by 20 percentage points, primarily due to a decline in private debt that more than offset the rise in public debt. Despite this decrease, the ratio remains 8 percentage points above pre-pandemic levels when global debt stood at 228.9% of GDP in 2019. Advanced economies were key contributors to the overall decline, with their average debt decreasing by 8 percentage points of GDP to 270% in 2023, just above the pre-pandemic level of 269% in 2019. Total debt in emerging markets rose by 6 percentage points of GDP in 2023, reaching 197.1% of GDP. This increase was primarily driven by China, where the total debt to GDP ratio surged from 275.6% in 2022 to 289% in 2023, exceeding its pandemic peak of 268.8%. Since the mid-1980s, when China's debt stood at around 70% of GDP, close to the average for emerging markets at the time, it has nearly quadrupled, reaching a level of 16 percentage points higher than the debt of the US in 2023. However, in absolute dollar terms, China's total debt remains significantly below that of the United States. No other major economy has experienced a comparable rise in debt relative to GDP. The sharpest acceleration began in 2009, driven largely by soaring non-financial corporate debt. Notably, more than half of the global debt to GDP increase between 2008 and 2023 can be attributed to China's rapid debt expansion, surpassing the rest of the world. On the other hand, total debt in low-income developing countries saw a modest increase from 87% of GDP in 2022 to 88.3% in 2023, with the entire rise attributed to public debt. In 2023, global private debt exceeded $150 trillion. As a share of GDP, it declined by 2.8 percentage points from 146.2% in 2022 to 143.4% in 2023, falling below its pre-pandemic level of 144.2%. This reduction in private debt was a key factor contributing to the overall decline in global debt in 2023. Private debt declined in both advanced economies and low-income developing countries, while remaining stable in emerging market economies, excluding China. In advanced economies, the private debt to GDP ratio fell from 164.4% in 2022 to 158.2% in 2023, while in low-income developing countries it edged down from 39% to 38.1% over the same period. The United States contributed to the overall debt reduction with a 3 percentage point decline in total debt, entirely driven by a 6 percentage point drop in private debt, which fell to 150% of GDP. This reduction was observed in both household debt and non-financial corporate debt, which decreased by 3.4 and 2.5 percentage points respectively. In contrast, China experienced a sharp increase in private debt, rising by 6.5 percentage points to reach 205% of GDP in 2023, up from 198.5% in 2022. The IMF identified three key factors contributing to the decline in private debt in 2023: current and expected future growth, inflation surprises, and economic uncertainty. In 2023, global public debt reached $98 trillion. As a share of GDP, it resumed its upward trajectory, increasing by 2 percentage points to 93.8%. Since the early 1970s, global public debt has tripled, rising from around 30% of GDP to over 90% of GDP in 2023. The public debt to GDP ratio rose on average in emerging markets, climbing from 64.7% in 2022 to 69% in 2023. Similarly, in low-income developing countries, public debt increased from 47.9% of GDP in 2022 to 50.3% in 2023. In contrast, advanced economies, excluding the United States, saw a decline in their public debt ratios. Both the United States and China experienced increases in public debt. In the US, the public debt to GDP ratio grew by 3 percentage points, rising from 120.4% in 2022 to 123% in 2023. Meanwhile, China's public debt climbed from 77.1% to 84.3% of GDP over the same period. In 2024, Japan holds the highest public debt to GDP ratio at a staggering 251.9%, primarily due to decades of government bailouts, stimulus measures following the 1992 stock market crash, and aging population. Sudan follows closely with a ratio of 238.8%, reflecting ongoing economic struggles and heavy reliance on borrowing. Singapore ranks third at 168.3%, driven by its strategic investments and financial policies. Bhutan, despite its small size, has a significant public debt to GDP ratio of 122.8%, largely due to the financing development projects. The United States, despite having the world's largest economy, ranks sixth, with its high debt levels attributed to military spending, tax cuts, and underfunded social programs. Meanwhile, although China's overall debt continues to rise, it ranks 28th in public debt to GDP ratio. Many emerging and low-income economies are grappling with heightened debt distress risks. Around 25% of emerging economies are facing default-like spreads on their sovereign debt. Meanwhile, approximately 15% of low-income economies are already in debt distress, with an additional 45% considered at high risk. To mitigate debt vulnerabilities, policymakers need to adopt comprehensive strategies that include credible medium-term fiscal frameworks, vigilant monitoring of private sector debt, and targeted reforms to enhance revenue mobilization. Additionally, boosting medium-term growth through structural reforms and international cooperation on taxation and carbon pricing could help reduce debt pressures globally. Proactive and coordinated policy measures are essential to safeguard financial stability and support sustainable economic growth in the face of mounting global debt challenges. Thank you very much for your kind listening.